Hello, welcome to another TTech Go session. My name is Chris Jones. I work on the platform, TRIRIGA platform development team. And in this session, we're going to talk about the TRIRIGA UX framework. And specifically, we're going to be building an application using the UX framework. So this is going to be mostly tutorial-based. I'm going to take a simple example and build out an application. Agenda, I have very few slides here. Mainly, I just want to jump into the tutorial, and we already have some good documentation. So I'm going to go over some references, some links you can use, and then just jump into the tutorial. So here's a couple links. First, we have a link to the UX articles. These articles were written by the amazing Jay. He did an awesome job explaining the new TRIRIGA UX framework, and it goes into details on how to build an application, what things mean, pretty much the ins and outs. Highly recommend reading through that documentation if you plan on building an application that's on the IBM Developer Works site. Second, I have a link to Google Polymer. So if you listen to the previous session, the overview of the UX framework, I mentioned that the UX framework is all the client web-based stuff is based off of Google Polymer, which is a implementation of the new HTML5 specification for web components. And the Google Polymer site has got a ton of good reference materials, tutorials. I imagine going through there, you'll be in that site just as much as looking through TRIRIGA documentation. They do a really good job, so highly recommend looking through that site if you plan on building your own UX applications or even tweaking. So with that, I'm just going to jump straight into the tutorial. We will be building a simple people application. We're going to list some people. We're going to edit some people data. And hopefully everything works out okay. I'm going to take you through building up the model. So I mentioned all this. And if you have not watched the first session, the overview session for the UX framework, probably good to stop now and look at that. I don't want to repeat a whole lot of information there, but we did go over what is a model, what is a view, so please go over that if you haven't. So in this tutorial, we will be building up a model. Where are we getting our data, where we're getting our people data. We're going to throw some space data in there, and then we're going to wire everything up and create our view. And mostly, we're probably going to be playing in that view, showing things to the user and editing data, all that stuff. So here we go. Okay, so let's get going on this tutorial. The first step we're going to do is wire up all the metadata pieces for our application. So first, let's go to the Tools menu. In the other presentation, I showed where the new Model Designer, View Designer, Model and View Designer, and Application Designer fit. It's in the Tools portal. There's a UX Designers section, portal section. So in here, first let's start with our Model and View Designer. And we want to create a new model. And again, the model is where we define where the data is coming from, what kind of data, and how it's related. So let's add a new model. And this is pretty simple to create a new model. Just create a new model record. Here, let's call it, in TRIRIGA, we usually have our prefixes. For TRIRIGA, it's try, and then if you're doing your own stuff, you come up with your own three-letter prefix. So for this tutorial, I'm going to do TUT, and we're going to kind of create an application to see interact with some people data. So I'm going to call it TUT people. And I'm going to use that for both for the name, the ID, and the exposed name to keep it simple. And later on, we're going to add some data sources, but for now, let's just keep that blank. I'm going to create that. So now we have a model created. Next, we want to go back to the Tools menu and create a web view. Here, same thing. We can just simply add the web view. And here, I'm going to name it I'm going to give the name the same and the ID the same. But for exposed name for view, this is really important. We have to use a HTML naming convention here. So for the web component standard, basically we're creating a new HTML tag, our own custom tag. And to tell the browser that it's a custom tag versus a native tag would be like a div or a body or an anchor. So to tell the browser that we have our own custom tag, we have to put a dash, at least one dash, inside the name. So here, let's just do TUT people. So instead of camel casing, we can just do a dash notation there. So now that the browser will be okay with that. So just going to create that. The component type we're going to do is view, because it is a view. So I'm going to create that. And then next, now that we have got a model and a view, we need to link those together for our application. And let's do that in the model designer. We create a new, model and view designer. We're going to create a new model and view record. Let's just call this people. Give it the same ID, exposed name, people. And the view name, or the model name, we can just point to our view and our model that was just created. View type is web view. Right now this is empty. This is going to be in the future, if we ever have new view types, we'll be able to change that there. So now we have a model and view all set up. We can create that. And then there's one last piece of metadata we need to create. We go to the application designer. And why the application designer is there is more for future-proofing this metadata structure. So it'll allow us to create different application types. Right now it's an MVC application. In the future we may have different type of applications, but we want to use them interchangeably. This extra layer of metadata will allow for that. So let's name this one also to people. And let's give it a label of just people. The application type is model and view. The app name, this is actually just pointing to the model and view. So that was people. An instance ID. So almost 99% of the time, you'll probably just want to use a -1. Instance ID is if you want to give context to your application from the start. This would be some sort of record ID, most likely. But normally with these applications, you want to launch into them, and then the application dictates what instance you're looking at. So here we'll put -1. And create that. So now we have our wired up metadata. We can't really do anything with that yet because there's nothing to view. But I can show you. So the URL for this application that we just wired up will be your host name, your context. I have a dev as context path of my web server, and then /p/web/ and then the application name. So if we try to go to that, we get an error, which is nothing happens. And this is to be expected because we haven't created any views yet. So let's start creating our view now. So I have a folder here on my local desktop. It's empty right now. We have a utility called WebViewSync that helps us sync local files from your desktop and push them to your TRIRIGA server. So in my example, my TRIRIGA server is running locally, but even if it was not running locally, if it's on a server somewhere, the same steps would apply. And you'd be able to interact with these files just the same way. So I've already downloaded the WebViewSync.jar. We will be making this jar available through, I believe, the developer worksite. So now that we have our jar, this is a command line utility. So I'm going to go to a terminal, and I'm at the same directory here. So I have WebViewSync, and the command line is this jar works both on Windows and Mac. So if you're using Windows, you're still okay. So the first thing we want to do is initialize WebViewSync. So it's a jar, so we have to use Java to run it. We give it a jar tag. We're giving the Java executable, the tag jar, just so we know that we want to execute this jar. And then we want to execute the WebViewSync jar. Now, if we do it without any parameters, it gives you some help. So this help's pretty useful for all the commands that are available in WebViewSync. And the first thing we want to do is an init. So we just type in WebView, we execute the jar, type in init. Now you need to give the full URL to your TRIRIGA server, including the context path if you have one. So for me, I have localhost, port 8080, and the context path of dev. So now you need to, all this communication, pulling files down, is authenticated using a TRIRIGA user. So I'm going to log in, and it tells me the test was successful, and it wrote some initialization files. If we go back to the web files, our directory here, we have a new file here. This has just got all those parameters that we were just configuring. So now that we have initialized our WebViewSync folder, we want to run another command to pull in your view. So WebViewSync can pull in all the view files for a particular view, one or more views, and maintain those for you. And another thing we can do is we can create a starter view. So we've created our view, but it has no files yet. So we have it has a little utility for creating a starter for you. So we're going to run the command add view. We want to tell it the view name. So we do -v view to say, here's my view name. And our view was TUT, and this is using an exposed name that we configured in our metadata, people. And then we also want to tell it to do the starter. So here's our command. Let's hope we typed it right. Okay, so it pulled in all the files, which there were none, so that's fine. Let's go back and see what we got. And we have a new HTML file. It created a folder, tut people. So that's what the view it pulled in. And now we have a new HTML file there. So if we go back and run, I refresh the page back on our application, and notice now we actually get something. Starter view for tut people. So that's the HTML that generated for us for our starter view just to get us started. It just gives us a little tag there. So I'm going to switch over to, I'm using Sublime Text. This is a text editor for Mac and PC. Feel free to use this if you'd like. There is a trial version, but I believe you have to pay for it. But any sort of text editor that handles syntax highlighting should work fine for you. And in Sublime Text, I am going to add the folder that we created. So now notice here we have tut people. This is the same directory I was just showing you. And I'm going to open up that file that was created. So here is our initial view file. I'm going to go over the structure of this HTML file. This structure is mainly dictated by Polymer. And like I said before, highly recommend going to the Polymer site. So if you look in Polymer, you will see this will look very, very familiar. So all of their tutorials should help a lot, even in the context of building applications for TRIRIGA. So the first thing you'll note is we have these link tags up at the top, and these link tags are for importing other HTML files. So we created an HTML file. It can be imported itself. This is all based off of the relative path. So here we're backing out one directory. We're going into the directory triplat view behavior, and we're importing the file triplat view behavior HTML. So basically this file is provided by the platform, and it is used down here. We notice this behaviors. This behaviors is a way for extending other functionality, and we've done a lot of this wiring up work for you in this file. So anytime you create a new view file or your main top level view file, it's important that this is in there. But if you're using the starter to generate it for you, it does it automatically for you. Here we have another link. This one's paper material. This is actually a component that we use that's a Polymer, provided by Polymer. And we're providing the whole Polymer library within TRIRIGA for you to use. And notice here we have a tag called paper material that's imported here. Now it makes this custom tag functional as a custom tag. And this might look a little strange to you, as these are some kind of custom elements. So the next part of the page is the DOM module. This is where you will have all of your HTML that is going to be put onto the page. Here we have a style tag. We can do styling. One cool thing about web components is it's encapsulated. So this style will only affect this particular component. It won't bleed out. And then we have this template. Basically, the template is going to be stamped onto the DOM in the browser. So whatever you put here will be stamped out every time this component is used. We have our HTML. That's what printed out that little box that said starter view. And then finally in the bottom we have a script tag, some Polymer notation. Basically we're creating a custom component using this Polymer API. We tell it what tag it is, and then we can also put other JavaScript methods in here, and we will be doing that later in this tutorial. So there we have it. There is the getting your view rendered. Now let's dive in a little deeper. And before I do that, I want to show the doc page. So if you go to that same URL we were doing before, /p/web/doc, you get to the component documentation page running on TRIRIGA. The first thing you'll see are TRIRIGA platform components. So here's all the components that you can use, and all the documentation on how to use them. We'll be using this one a lot, TriPlat DS. The DS stands for data source. It's for accessing data on TRIRIGA. So this is a very handy page here. Next, we have some core components that you probably won't need, but they're there that the core platform uses. And then we also have third-party components. These are all the components that we made available that are Polymer components. They are broken down in a couple categories. Iron are their non-visual type components, non-styled. And then they have paper components, which are styled in their material design. So feel free to use those, and I'm going to show some more examples of using paper components and platform components. So use this page. It's very, very helpful. Use while you're developing. Also use the Polymer page while you're developing. Very useful. So now let's start adding some functionality to our view. And first off, we need to be able to push this file when we make a change up to TRIRIGA. And to do that automatically, we can come back here to our terminal or command line window. And we can use the command sync. And then we have to tell it which view to sync, or we could tell it to sync all views. And what this will do is actively track any changes. So here, if we make a change, let's just add people there. If we save that file, we come back here and notice it is signing on, and it pushed that file. So if we go back to our web page and refresh, now that people is stuck in there. So that's what that'll be running. So now we can make edits and everything will be good. Also, something I want to note is when I develop, I like to use Chrome myself. Personal preference, I like their developer tools the best. We of course still develop on other browsers, but for my main development, I like to use Chrome. And I also like to keep the console window up so I can see if there's any errors while I'm going. It's easier to catch things right when you make the error in your coding than try to figure it out down the line. So I keep this console up. And I'll show you some tips and tricks in using the console and the debugger to help us as we develop. So let's see, this is kind of a weird page, and it just has a little box there. A lot of applications nowadays, we have a little header. Let's add a header. Let me show you how to do that. And luckily, Polymer has a built-in header. We're going to use that guy. So first we need to import it. And this guy is called Paper Header Panel. So I'm going to add that import there. I am also going to start using it here inside my template. And another cool thing about Sublime is it has a plugin to do some auto-completing specifically for Polymer. So here you notice I did my paper header panel, and it automatically filled in some stuff for me. And it did put in a toolbar for me, but I do have to remember to add the import for that toolbar, or else it will get an error. So that's simple enough. I add my header. So now I have my toolbar. Let's just, and inside this toolbar, this is what's going to show up at the top of the page. I'm going to simply put in some text here. I'll just say people app so we know what we're looking at. And I'm actually going to separate these. The second div here is where you put in the content. And don't worry, this is not all just magic. All the documentation, you can look at the Polymer documentation for this component on how to use it. It's pretty easy to follow, and they have good examples. So don't think that this is just magic, that you should automatically know how to do this and that this is the body. This is just their convention. And what I'm going to do here, our tabs are off. Let's fix our tabs. I'm going to copy our little card there and stick it inside of the content of our header. Now this might not look perfect, but let's see what we get. I saved it, refresh the page, and just like that, now we have our header. Cool. So it's starting to look more like an app. But it's not very useful unless we really have some data. So let me show you how to pull in data into our application. I'm going to add an import for TriPlat.ds, and this is the main way of grabbing data from our model that we configured. And this is a non-visual component, so it can go anywhere. So we're going to use this component, but we do have a problem because our model is empty right now. So we have to define our model to be able to grab people data. So let's switch back over to TRIRIGA, and let's configure our model so we can pull that data. First, I'm going to go to my reports. I have predefined a query for our demo. So it's this guy here, people all. It's a very, very simple query. Let me copy this. We'll need that later. It's a very simple query, just pulls from employee data, gives us all of them. And we have some columns: first name, last name, nickname, description, title. Whatever you want, you can add to your query. You can expose that through your model, your data source. So these are important here: first name, last name, nickname. So these labels for your column in the UX, in the configuration of your data source, and specifically for a query data source, we use those column labels to know which column which field to use. And we do this instead of using the field name, because for multi-business object queries, there could be multiple fields with the same name. So we needed a way to distinctly recognize each column, so we're using the label there. And you can make that label unique. So that is our query. Now let's hook that up into a data source in our model. So let's jump into the model designer. Let's open up our model, and let's create a data source. Expand this out. So we need to create the data source for people. We can, let's just call it tut people. And expose name, this is how we're going to reference this data source in our view file. So let's make it simple. Let's just call it people, because that's what we're grabbing. The data source type, we are going to use query. We're going to check this multiple records because we want to bring back, all the records in the query. So it's going to be more than one, potentially more than one. We need to pick our module. Try people, our business object, try people, and all this other stuff we don't need. The list type name, UOM type name, this is for list and UOM data source types. Use session. It's better to keep this off. I think in our shipping applications, all of these are off. This is to prevent using stateless interactions with TRIRIGA. Read only. We do want to be editing. We are going to be editing this data, so we can keep that unchecked. Enable context security. I'm going to let another group discuss security, so let's ignore that for now. Section name, that is for smart section data source. Legacy form, we don't need that. We're not creating. Query name, this is one we want. So here, we're going to put in our query, the name of the query that I was just showing you. Create workflow, we're not doing creating, so we don't need to specify any workflow there. Related data source and related association name, we will be using these in a future data source. That's for linking data, understanding how to get data. So all of that is as we want. So we configured our query data source. Now we need to start adding some fields. So if we run this in the view, there won't be any fields to show. So let's just do a quick add. So we want first name, and I'm going to use first name is our exposed name, and our name. This is how we'll identify this value once we're in the view. Let's add another one. Last name. And I'm going to quickly go through this. And we want nickname. And notice all of these I'm keeping as string. We could change those if we wanted. But we want to keep them as string. These are all string fields just to keep things simple for this demonstration. And title. Okay, so there we go. We have our data source created. We're good to go. So let's go back to our view. We've added our fields, added the query. So now let's jump into our code, TRIPLAT-DS. The usage of this tag you can find in the documentation here. I can show you what we're going to do. We're already at TRIPLAT-DS. And here's a simple example. Name people, we're going to need that. And data, we're going to need to bind to get our data. It's pretty simple there. So here, we're going to use name equals, and we called our data source people. And now we want to be able to access that data. So I'm going to bind it to a variable called people. Now this is probably the first time have you seen this notation here. this curly bracket, then I have a name. This is a Polymer construct for doing, they call data binding. So it basically binds data and lets data flow in and out of components. So here, we're going to be retrieving all this data from the server. It's going to be in the form of an array because we check that multiple records checkboxed in our data source. So it's going to be coming back as an array. We want to be able to access that data. So basically we're saying, hey, I want to store that in a variable called people. So let's save this and go back to our screen. No, nothing really changed, which is expected. But let's go over to this network tab. All of the data communication between this TriFlatDS and TRIRIGA will be using AJAX. So if you set the filter here in your network tab to XHR, this is basically AJAX. Now you can see our traffic, and notice there is a request for people. You can see it retrieve that data for you, and you can actually preview the data, and we can see all the first name, all the data that came from TRIRIGA. And notice here the size 1,000. We pulled 1,000 records there. There is a way to do pagination through TriFlatDS if you're going to be dealing with too much data that you don't want to pull all at once. So first thing, now we have our data. Let's display the data. So I'm going to get rid of this paper material. I don't want that guy anymore. I'm going to start doing some styling here. I'm just going to give this, this way it's easy to read. Give this div the class of content so we know what it is. Let me get rid of this paper material. We're not using it anymore. And now let's try to show all the people data. So with web components, there's a concept of a template, and that's basically to stamp out things to the DOM. And in Polymer, they give us a template called DOM repeat. This is basically going to iterate over data and then print out stuff, some HTML for each element. So here we want to bind people. This is where we grabbed up here in TriFlatDS. We're going to bind it items for this template. And in here, let's just do a simple div. And we want to output, so we're going to use the curly bracket notation again. So within the construct of template, for every item you're iterating over, unless specified, it will populate a variable called item for you. And let's print out the first name. And I know it's the first name because that's what we configured in the data source up on TRIRIGA. So I'm going to save that. Let's see if this works. So there we go. So we printed out all those 1,000 names right there on the page. So that is great, but one thing I will caution you, printing out 1,000 things onto the page can be slow, and we want this to be fast, right? Polymer has a really nice component for printing things, for stamping things like a big collection out very efficiently. That way it will render quickly. And that is called iron list. So let's go ahead and put in an iron list, instead of using that DOM repeat, I'm going to have to do some styling here, just because that's what, to be able to use this iron list, we have to dictate the height. So I'm just going to do a couple things here. I'll talk through them as I go. I already have this kind of planned out, so we can remove this paper material. So here, this layout flex is apply. This is CSS basically, but this is a Polymer thing to make it easy to share styles. So Polymer already defines some really cool layouts for us. And in CSS3, there's a concept of flex layout. And so we're taking advantage of the flex layout. And I encourage you guys to go look up flex layout. But I think you'll get a good idea of what it is here as I go through. So I'm gonna style, so host is my element. Iron list is, this is just the CSS selector for the iron list component. I want to make it layout fit. So it's basically going to fit the whole space it has. And that's the important part for this here. So now let's use our iron list. And I'm going to give it also items people. This tag also needs to know how to get its data. Let me close that tag. Also for iron list, we have to give it a template, a blank template. So I'm going to do that. So this should function just how we had it before. But it should do it quicker. I don't know if you picked it up, but it loads much quicker. There was a little delay before. And what that does is dynamically renders as the user scrolls. So only puts stuff onto the DOM that needs to be there. It's a pretty clever trick to speed things up. So now that we have efficiently rendered the first name, I'm going to quickly style this up because that's kind of ugly, and we don't want to write ugly applications, right? We want pretty applications. I'm going to use another paper component called paper card. And basically what I want to do is put a card for every person. So let me do that here. I'm going to do some trickery, copy and paste. So let's call this guy and remove this. So now for each person, we're going to give it a card. Oh, I don't want that. I'll do it myself. So now we have a paper card for every person, but we want to fill it with some information. I'm just going to copy and paste here. I'm going to take out this flex. I'll talk about that in a minute. So now I just am putting out the first name and the last name, and for a paper card, if we render this, it'll still look kind of ugly. We want to style it up. You can see a little shadow starting to appear there, and we have first and last name. So let's continue styling this to make it look a little prettier. So we created that person div. So in my person div, I want to use this this flex layout to style that up. Here I'm going to use vertical, and I want it centered on the screen, and I want it to flow vertically, so up and down. And then I also, for that paper card within that person div, I'm going to dictate that it's 300 pixels. That way we're consistent with our width. Give it some padding, some margin. And then I also wanted to use some flex layout. I want it to be horizontal. That way the name, your first name, last name aren't on top of each other. They're next to each other. And then finally, inside our little divs that have our name and that person card, I want to add some padding to the right so we have some separation. So let's look at that. And there you go. Now we have some nice, cool-looking cards in the center of our screen. So now, in this example, pulling data from TRIRIGA and rendering it to the page. So what's next? One thing you might notice is, hey, the sort order seems to be a little off, and it's kind of hurting my eyes. It's down here at the bottom. You know, we have C, we have R. So let's fix that, and we can fix that pretty easily using some functionality of Triplat DS. So Triplat DS, you can embed a component called Triplat Query that controls the data and how it's coming out. But when you start using Triplat Query and you're not paginating, and this is all laid out in the documentation for this component, we want to use filtered data instead of just data. And the first thing we want to do is sort it. And so that was hurting our eyes. So what do we want to sort on? Let's sort on first name. So you just tell it the, not fifth name. So we tell it the attribute name. So we had our first name, last name, nickname. So we just want to sort on first name. And we can also add a tag in here for descending if we want it in reverse order. So now if we refresh, we should get some A's at the top, yes. So now it's sorted by the first name. Much easier on the eyes. But the problem is we have 1,000 records here, and I really set up data for my name, Chris Jones, and that's at the kind of in the middle of the page, and I don't want to scroll every time I want to show you my name. So it's probably good to add a filter. And we can easily do that in this Triplat DS also. So how about we add a input box to our header so we can filter down that data. We do have a component just for that. It's called the search input, Triplat search input. So let's import that at the top of our page. And in this toolbar, let's add a little bit of, let's change this just a tad. Let's add a div here. And let's give it a class so we can style it up. We want to be able to put the toolbar where we want. So we're going to create our Triplat search input. And it can take a value, and we want to use that data binding. Let's bind it to a variable called filter value. That way we can use it later. So now we have a search input. And if we go look at that, it probably doesn't look very good. Yeah. So let's style this up so we put this box, how about over here on the right? So we could just do that in CSS now. So I'm going to use some magic and do a copy and paste. So here I want to style up that toolbar div. I want to, this flex means, hey, I want to take up all the space I can take. I want to make it horizontally laid out. I want to make it justified and centered. So justified is going to, for every element there, it's going to spread them apart. So now if we do that, let's save that guy, refresh the page, and there we go. Now we have our label here on the left, and notice it's center because we use the center. We did justified and horizontal, so that's why this guy's way over here. But we still have a problem. This guy is black on dark, which is kind of hard to see. So let's fix that. So let's style up that input box using our CSS. So here, this is going to be a little tricky, but Polymer does a good job on their page of explaining using these. This is called a mix-in. So we have our component tri-plat search input, and if you look at the documentation for that input, we have defined style. You can style the tri-plat search input, so that input box. And there we want to set the color to white. So basically we're saying this guy, in Polymer notation, this is a variable, a mix-in variable. And now we could just apply whatever style, and it puts it in there for us. And what's nice about this is we don't have to know the structure, the HTML structure of that component to be able to style it. So now if we refresh, we have white text, which is great. But notice it's not filtering. Not good. Let's get that filtered. So let's come down to our tri-plat DS. We also have a tag that we can use to do this filtering, similar to the sort. It's called tri-plat query filter. There we go. And we have to tell it the name of the column or the data element that we want to filter on. And then we want to give an operator. So here we want contains. We're doing like a filter. So we just want to do a contains. Value. Let's use our filter value. And also this tag has a cool switch to ignore blank, and I can give you an example there. So now we're filtering, so all of the elements have to contain blank. None of our elements contain blank, so notice it disappears. But if we search, now we get things, okay? That's not really what we want. So we have a little flag here that we can use. Ignore if blank. So basically it's saying ignore this filter if we don't have anything to filter on. So let's refresh there. And there we go. Now we have our data. It's blank, so it doesn't filter anything. If I type in Chris, it now filters everything that contains Chris. And there's mine here. But then what if I want to search by my last name? Notice nothing shows up. So we want to be able to filter by first or last name. Good thing that tri-plat query can do ORs. So we're just going to do a tri-plat query OR. And let's copy this first name and just this first name filter and just change this to last name. So now I want to filter by first, so the first name I want it to contain, only show things that contain the filter value or contain, the last name contains the filter value. So now if we refresh our page, we can still search by Chris for first name, and we can still now search for last name, Jones. And there's 3 Joneses. So now we've added filtering. That adds a lot, makes it much easier for a user to use things. But we don't want to stop here. We want to continue going and building out more usable apps. This app, we got some requirements that we wanted it to be able to edit nicknames. So that's what we're going to do. So now we want to be able to drill in to a person and edit information or view extra information about that user. So how about we add a button to our little card to be able to drill into our people. So let's do that. I'm going to use a component called paper button, or I'm sorry, paper icon button. So let me import that paper icon button. This is supplied by Polymer. I also want to use some icons, and we have to import the icons. So I do an import of iron icons.html, and this gives us access to all those icons that we might want to use. So now, let's dive into our paper card here. So here's our paper card. We want to be able to add a little icon button there. So let's do it. So I add a paper icon button. So I'm going to use, because these are people, I want to use face. In the Polymer documentation, you'll easily find all the different icons. These are SVG icons, so they're nice, quick performing. So let's save that. Let's look at what we have, and there we go. We have our little button. Doesn't do anything yet, but it's there. Actually, I want this button over here on the right. That's really easy. We can use the flex layout and say, hey, let's have the last name take up as much space as it can, and that should push that button over to the right. So that's what flex means. It's taking up more space. So there we go. Now it's over to the right. And I can illustrate that flex. So notice this guy here that doesn't take up any space. The flex guy takes up all the space, and then this guy doesn't take up much space, only what it needs. So that's what that flex means, is just take up as much space as I can. So now we have a nice layout. We've got some names and buttons. Now we have to do something when that button is tapped. So we're going to do a tap handler on this button. And this is a Polymer thing. They have this a tap event, which helps you handle both clicking with a mouse and tapping on a touch device, because essentially that's the same interaction. But in code, many times for different browsers, you have to do different code to do that. So it does that for you, which is really nice. So I'm going to say, hey, when this is tapped, call the function onPersonTap. Well, I don't have that function yet, so let me go down to my script. This is going to be the first time we write some script. So all I'm doing is saying, hey, call this function. And when we're doing the event handler, it passes in an event. And one thing, if you're, one tip to do, if you don't know what kind of data you're getting from maybe Polymer from the browser, you could do a console.log and put in that element, that variable. So this function is going to be called when that's clicked. And we need some information from this event so we know the data that was being clicked, right? So let's just do a console log of that element, and I can show you what that gives us. So if we click on the event, the person, we get this custom event, and we have all these things. Here, what we really want is this target element, and we're going to use that target to identify how to get the data, okay? So we need to get the data of what was clicked. So first we want to get access to the iron list, which is iterating over that data. Let's give it an ID so we can reference it. Let's just give it the ID of iron list. So we can get the model from the iron list. So here's the notation from Polymer. This $$ iron list, this basically says, hey, give me the element with the ID iron list. This is, Polymer does this for us. It's kind of a quick way to access elements inside of your component. It's very handy here. And looking at the Polymer documentation, there's a method on this component, model for element. And let's do e.target. We saw that. And on the model, this is basically what's being iterated over. And for that particular task, it's the element that what was iterated over for that particular person. So we can get the person information using the model.item. The same thing here. Notice we call item.lastname. The same concept here. So let's print that guy out to see what that looks like. So we refresh. I click on it, and notice here I get an object, first name A, last name man. Another thing to notice, there's an underscore ID. Every record that's coming from TRIRIGA from TriPly.ds, we're going to give you the spec ID or the record ID for each one of those records. Is very, very handy. It's going to be a unique ID for that element, and we're going to use that coming up next. So we click on that person. I want to go to kind of a new page, and most new applications with web applications, when you click on it, it updates the URL to kind of tell you where you're at, and it also helps so if you can bookmark that particular URL, and it'll take you to the context of what you're looking for. And for these single-page applications, there's a concept called routing that kind of can do this for us. And luckily, the platform has provided a routing component to make this easy for us. So basically what I want to do is click on this, go to the details page. So we want to update the URL with enough information so we can go to that details page. And we're going to use that ID as that information. So I'm going to include a component, a set of components, in the TriRouting package. So I'm just going to import TriPlat routing. And at the top of the page here, I'm going to define my route. So we're going to have two routes, our main page that we're already on, and we're going to do a person route. So we use the TriPlat route. We have to give it a name. So here, this is the people page. Let's call it people. We have to give it a path. Let's just do a /. So that's defining our main route. That was easy. It's our default route up at the top. Let's copy that guy. And our other route, let's call it person. So the person route, we need a little more information on that path. So instead of just /, let's do person ID. And notice this little colon just designates, hey, this is a variable. And we have some cool functionality I'll show in the later in this tutorial on how to pull out that information from that guy. So here we just call that person ID. We know we're going to put the person ID on the path. We defined our route. I'm also going to give this route an ID because I want to reference in our JavaScript. Let's just call it person route. So there we go. We have our routes defined, but now we have to tell our template kind of what to do with our different routes. So what we're going to do is use triplat route selector. So this is going to take the current route and select something. And let me add that there. Also within the route selector, I'm going to use iron pages. Let me fix our tabbing. So now we have an iron pages, which is basically just going to select one page at a time. So this is what we're doing, routing. We want to select a page. So now our first page, let's define our first page using section. Fix this tab. Section's a HTML tag, just to say, hey, here's a section of the page. We can say, hey, we want to define this as the people route, and also let's tell it this is the default route. So now if we refresh the page, hopefully everything works fine. We don't get any errors. So it's rendering the default page. Now we want to say, hey, when I click on this guy, we want to go to this other page. So let's define a new page. I'm going to add some space here. Let's add another section in this iron pages. And let's say route is person. And if this works, we're going to be very excited. So let's just put in a woot there. And now, okay, so that won't route because we're not actually doing any routing. Remember, we put the ID on this person route. So instead of just logging that person, let's use this $ notation to get the person route element, the component. And now we want to, there's a function on this component called navigate, which tells us, okay, now we can navigate to this route. And we need to tell it the information that what we're routing to. And we defined up top there, remember, we defined this person ID. So let's give it that person ID in a JavaScript object. So we're saying person ID, set it to person._ID. So now we save that, we refresh the page, and it didn't work. Now we get a woot over here. Let's find out what our problem is. Oh, I know what our problem is. We never imported iron pages. So let's save that. So here we go. Now we're here at our main page. If we want to click on one of these guys, notice our page changed to woot. And also notice that our ID changed. You know, we could always take that out. We go here, click on another guy. But now we can use the back button because this URL is kept in history in the browser. So there we go. We got routing done. That's pretty cool. But we want to do something more complex with it. You know, we want to show the details page. So let's start creating that details page. First off, I want to say that this page is getting kind of full. I don't want to do some more stuff here, more JavaScript. It's kind of, this page is doing enough. So let's create another component to compartmentalize that logic. So we can easily do that. I'm going to create a new file under that folder, tut people. What should we call it? Let's call it tut person.html. So I saved that. I created our file here in Sublime. And notice here it pushed tut person. So it got already pushed up to the server. Copy this guy. And now let's do some magic here. We want to do another DOM module called tut person. Let's just say so we created our first custom component. So, and this is just like we had before in that starter. We kind of did it manually. So now let me show you how we created this really simple custom component, and we want to use it in our other page for that route. First off, we have to import it. I'll just copy one of these guys as a base. And because this is relative, so we don't want to go into any other folder, we're in the same folder. So all we have to do is type in the file name, tutperson.html is the import. And here, instead of, we don't even need a section. We could just say tutperson. Let's give it our route. Let's move this guy. Save that. And then hopefully, if we click on this, ooh, nice, I created a custom component. Yay! So just like that, we created our own custom component, and now it's routing to that component for this page. That's really cool. Now we can really compartmentalize our logic here for dealing with this person. So let's continue building out this tut person page. So first of all, we kind of need to get that the person's ID, first thing we need. So let's import triplat routing, and let's use triplat route. I think I'm going to speed up a little bit and do more copy and pasting instead of coding now that we're starting to get the hang of this. So now we have triplat route, name person. I told you there's this cool parameter, param, so now we can grab data off of there. So now we have an object stored with the parameters of this page. So let's just output that to see what it is. So params, person ID. Let's see if that works. Okay, cool. So it matches this ID. Now we have that ID. Awesome. So now that we have the ID, we want to grab the data for this person ID. Luckily, we don't even have to change anything on the model. There's a cool little trick we can use with triplat.ds. So first, let's import triplat.ds. And I'm going to copy a data source here. So now we have triplat.ds. I give it an ID because I'm going to use that in the future for saving. I give it a name, people, just like we did before. So I'm using the people data source. I'm binding it to a person object. And notice here I'm using this tag called triplat.ds instance, and I give it an ID. instance ID, and I'm going to use params.personID. So what this is going to do is now populate just for that instance. So just give me the fields for this ID. I don't want to go find it in that array, just give it to me. So that's what this is going to do for you. So now I have this person object. So let's do, just so we can show this guy. So now, if we refresh this, that first name is A. I'm going to switch over to my record. Now, you notice I get Chris. So let's build out this interface really quickly and make it look cool. Because we want to write cool-looking applications. It's really important to us. So let's again import the paper card. Let's create that paper card here. Delete you. So I'm going to use a card to show all my info. And I am going to copy this. So here what I'm doing is doing the first name, space, last name. And I want to add some style. Let's add some style here. And I am going to do some copying here. So here what I'm doing is my host, so this component I want to fit, so fit everything. I also want to enable scrolling. So for you CSS people, that's just overflow auto. And then I want to center it, text align center. And then for my paper card, I'm going to say, hey, let's do a card. The width is 40 or 400 pixels. Give it some padding, some margin so it looks cool, and then reset that text alignment to the left. And so now if we save this guy, hopefully it looks a little better. So now we got a card. It says Chris Jones. Perfect. But now let's start. We want to know how to edit. It's great to read information. How do we edit information about on a record for TRIRIGA? So let's do that. So now we're going to need a new type of component for inputting data. And I'm going to use paper input. So I'm going to do my import for paper input. And through the magic of copy and paste, I am going to add 3 fields here. So notice I have paper input, label. I'm going to do nickname, title, description. So it's going to give our label. And then a value. I'm going to bind it to person.nickname, person.title, and person.description. So if I save this, and we pulled that data, and it's already pre-populated. My nickname, Sippy, don't ask. Long story. Title, Mr. And description, developer. So that's bringing data from my person record, the tribe people record for Chris Jones. And now I want to be able to save that data. Let's create a button so we can save that data. So I'm going to use a paper button. So I have a paper button. And let's do paper button. And then save. So now we have this paper button, and when it's clicked or tapped, I want it to do something. So I'm going to call this function on save tap. And so let's create our JavaScript function to be called. So we go on save tap. Let me add a little bit of styling here, let's add a margin so our buttons don't stick together. We're going to add multiple buttons. And let's just do console.log to say save, so we know that it's wired up properly. So here we go. Now we have our button and save. Cool. So now we actually want to save. Crazy. So now that we have we know when this is tapped and we want to save the data, we can use this triplat DS to do some saving. And I already gave an ID of person DS. So what I'm going to do, through the power of copy and paste, I'm going to use the same notation, this $.person DS. So this is getting that data source component, and I'm calling a method update record. So it's basically going to just say, hey, save this data. That's it. Really simple. Just save the data. And let's see if that works. So I'm going to refresh here. Let's change my nickname. I want a better nickname. So super cool is my new nickname. So let me save that. So we didn't really get much indication. But if we do go to the network tab, we should see, notice we had a put. So this put request to the server is what saved it. So if I refresh this page, now I get super cool is still there. So that got pushed to the server. Awesome. So we were able to save data. But one thing, hey, I want to be able to know as a user that got saved. That was kind of confusing. Oh, did that save? What happened? So Polymer has a really cool component called paper toast. Let's use our paper toast. And copy that. So I did my import for paper toast. I'm going to put it at the bottom of the page here because I want it to be on top of everything. I give it an ID because I'm going to need to reference it. Some text, person saved. So that's just saying, hey, we saved it for you. And one cool thing about this function call, it returns what's called a promise. And a promise will notify you when it's complete. So if it takes a while to save on the server, it'll come back and tell you when that has completed. And that's really easy to do. We just say .then, give it a function. So in this function is what is going to be executed when we're done. We want to bind this function to this, so I can say this $.toast.show. So what I'm doing here is saying, okay, when this update record completes, grab me the toast component here and call the show method. So let's see what happens there. So let's say my manager is like, hey Sippy, you're not that cool. So let's put it back to Sippy. Okay, fine. So I put it back to Sippy. I click save, and now we get this nice little passive indication. So you give some information to the user, say, hey, we saved your record. Continue on your business. So very, very nice interaction there. So there we go. We have we saved our data, which is really cool. Now let's see. Hey, I want to do more than just save data. I want to interact with data. I want to do stuff with a workflow. So I created a workflow for this tutorial that does some kind of magic with some data. So let's get that wired up. But the first thing we need to do if we want to call a workflow is we need to set that on the data source. So let's go back to the model designer, and let's expand. There's a little trick for you. We have, this is a hierarchical query. So if we expand that TUT people model, it'll show our data sources. So we can jump straight into our people data source. So if we scroll down on this form, notice we have the action groups. This is where we're going to be able to define that workflow. So I'm going to add an action group. I'm just going to call this default. And I don't need an ID. Let's also call the expose name default. Let's create this guy. And now let's add an action to this group. Let's call this guy update title. That's what we're going to do. We're going to update the title. Let's use that for the expose name too. We need to specify an action type. So we want to do a fire or workflow. So this is a try people workflow. And workflow name, I have already got this guy. So I created the workflow called TUT, try people synchronous update title. And we don't need state transition or anything else. So we're good to go here. Let's create this guy. Save and close. Save and close. And save and close. Okay, so now we should be able to call that workflow. Let's see how that's done. So I'm going to create another button. Do something cool. So let's do another function here. And I am going to copy this over, copy magic. So again, we're going to call this $person ds to get the data source component we want to call a function on. And again, we're going to call update record. There's many other, you could delete, you can create, there's a lot of different functions here, but we want to update. We still want to save whatever current state we have. Here's another thing that we could do, a refresh type. So this says, hey, after you're done doing whatever you need to do on the server, hey, please give me a copy of this data again so that I can update the view for my user. So this refresh type of server is saying to send that data back down. And then we can give an action group or action name to fire while we're saving this data. So here, remember, we called default and update title. So now it's going to basically go save the data, fire the workflow, and then return any updated data. So let's see what happens there. So do something cool, and there we go. It went to the server. It came back, and notice that it surrounded the title with some dashes and some curly brackets. Okay, maybe I exaggerated a little bit of, being really cool, but it does illustrate that we can fire workflow and do some stuff. So if I change this here to blah, do something cool, it'll send blah up and then come back with the brackets around. So there we go. That's an example of firing a workflow and how we can kind of react to what the workflow did. That's firing a synchronous workflow. So now we have some nice information about the person. How about let's see how we can pull in data, maybe not on the person record, but maybe associated to the person. So we can pull in the space data for that person. So let's see how that's done. So let's go back to our models, and let's open up that people model. So we have this section down here called child data sources. Let's add a child data source. And basically this child data source will use the context of a single record within its parent's data source. So the context for this will be a single person record, a single tribe people record. Here, let's call this 2T space. And let's just call it space for exposed name. I'm going to create just a business object, no query this time. It's going to be a single record. I'm just going to do the primary location for this person. So let's do location, try space. Nothing else we don't need to check, no query name. We do not need a related data source because essentially a child data source is related data source is the parent data source, but we do want to do related association name. So here we want to use has primary location. So now we have has primary location as our association. Let's add a field. And now that we're using a business object data source instead of a query, we can just use the actual BO field name. Let's just use try name TX, expose name. Oh. So here we go. Let's create that. Now we have a data source that is the space, the primary location for the user we selected. That's great. So let's see how we use that. Let's switch back over here. And I'm going to do some more copy and paste magic, and I will explain. So now we add another triplat DS. This time it's pointing to the space data source that we just created. And we have to, but this time we have to give it context because it's not that top level data source anymore. Now it is one below, so we have to give it a context using the triplat DS context. We need to say who the name of the data source, which is the parent, is people. And then a context ID is the person ID, so we can use those parameters again. So now we're saying, hey, grab me the associated primary space from the server for this person. And let's add another card here. So we can print out this location data. Let's use the H1 header location. And let's do div space.name. So now at runtime, we have location with the card, and then room. My location is room 2253. That's awesome. Now we pulled that associated data. If you look at our network traffic, notice we also have a space request. So this is a separate request, so it kind of makes things quicker so things can load at a different rate with the page. So now that we have location, let's fix our styling a little bit. Let's add a BR here because I want that to go underneath. So now we have location underneath my person card. So that's great. Now I have the space. But how about we add just to show some more linking of data, I also want to get the floor and the building. So let's see how we can do that. And luckily, the floor and the building are associated to that space record. So it can easily add another child data source to the person. Let's call this guy tut floor. Name it floor. Again, let's do business object, module location, business object floor. And now we do want to use a related data source because we don't want the person as the context. We want the space as the context. So here we had the touch space data source, and our association is parent floor. And let's add, let's create this. Let's do a quick add. Try name TX. Name. So there we go. We have our floor. And now I'm going to also add, while I'm here, a building. So let's do business object, module location, try building, and use the space. And the association name is parent building. And let's add a field. Name. So let's choose save and close. So now we have two more data sources. And let's wire them up here. I can do my copying here. These will be very similar to the space. So here we have the data source name floor, bind it to floor. In this context is the same. And here building, bind it to building, and the context is the same. So now we have our data sources, and we can output the names. There we go, building name, floor name, space name. So now we have much more information. So I'm on the Watson building, floor 2, room 2253. Okay, so now we showed editing data, retrieving data, getting associated data. Let's do something really quick and fun. Let's add a floor plan for that location. Let's see how hard it is to add a floor plan. So first, we're going to have to add a new component called TriPlat Graphic. This is a platform component. I am going to preemptively add some styling here for TriPlat Graphic. Oops. So here, the thing about a graphic is you have to dictate the height and width. So here I'm just going to do 350 pixels, height and width. A height and width could also be like 100%. It's very important because the content does not dictate the size of the component. So now we want to add our graphic. So we could just simply say TriPlat Graphic. And of course, this is documented in the documentation page. And so record ID, we need to give it the floor, what floor to show. And just like that, if we did everything right, we have a graphic. There we go. So here's the Watson floor 2. So that kind of shows the power of these components. You know, we have all this functionality you could just plug into and bind data to, wiring things up like that. So that concludes this tutorial. I hope everyone has gotten a lot out of this. I know I went over fast, but hopefully you can pause and play around through Polymer tutorials and also looking at our documentation and also looking at our shipped application code. You can probably learn a lot using what we ship. So thanks again. Bye-bye.